The rain pressed softly against the tall glass windows of the Cross mansion. Inside his study, Harrison Cross leaned forward, voice low but sharp enough to pierce through the air. His younger brother sat across from him, unaware of the weight carried by the words about to be spoken. "I can't stand her any more," Harrison muttered. In the hallway, Sylvie froze. Her hand gripped the edge of the doorframe as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Each word cut deeper than any argument ever could. Harrison didn't shout, didn't rage, yet the coldness in his tone felt like a blade pressed against everything they once shared. In that moment, Sylvie's world shifted. Those 6 words weren't just careless venting. They were a verdict. What would you do if the person you trusted most, the one who once promised to love you above all else, whispered that they couldn't stand you anymore? Would you stay and fight for the love that feels like it's slipping away? Would you confront them, demanding answers for the betrayal that drips from every syllable? Or would you walk away quietly, carrying the weight of words that can never be unsaid? Sylvie stood in that hallway, asking herself these same questions. Her heart pounded, her throat tightened, but her voice never rose. In silence, she wrestled with the truth. Sometimes the deepest pain comes not from what is done to you, but from what is spoken about you when you aren't meant to hear. Sylvie didn't storm into the room. She didn't beg or argue. Instead, she stood still, letting the sharp sting of his words echo in her chest. In that silence, her decision began forming, not out of anger, but out of clarity. For years she had lived in the vast mansion, waiting for footsteps that came. Late at night, meals left untouched, and conversations that never started. She had held on, believing love was still there, buried beneath the distance. But with one whisper, Harrison confirmed what her heart had long suspected: she was no longer wanted. Her pain wasn't loud, but it was heavy, and in that heaviness a quiet resolve grew. She would not confront him. She would not break in front of him. Instead, she would choose herself. As Sylvie steadied her breath, a thought pressed against her heart. If he believes I'm a burden, then he will never know what I carry within me. Her choice that night wasn't only about leaving a cold marriage. It was about protecting the life growing inside her, a secret she had not yet shared. Harrison's whisper became the moment. She realized she could no longer stay, not for herself, and not for the child who deserved more than silence and indifference. What would happen if the man who dismissed her ever discovered that truth? Would he regret the words that pushed her away, or would his pride blind him further? This was no ordinary departure. It was the beginning of a story where love, loss, and hidden strength would collide, and one secret would change everything. Before we follow Sylvie's journey, let me ask you, if you were in her place, what would you do after hearing those words? Would you confront the man you loved, or would you walk away with your dignity intact? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. And if this story already speaks to you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Mr. Ashford's Love Stories, and share it with others who value respect over wealth. Your support keeps stories like this alive, and I promise what comes next will move you even deeper. Harrison Cross was a man the city admired from a distance. At corporate galas and board meetings, he moved like a figure carved out of confidence. Reporters wrote about his rise from a modest background to millionaire status, calling him relentless, decisive, and magnetic in every room he entered. Deals followed him, investors trusted him, and competitors kept their eyes on him. But that was only the version of Harrison the world saw. The polished smile, the tailored suits, the firm handshake, none of it followed him home. Inside the walls of his mansion, his silence spoke louder than words. He wasn't cruel in the obvious sense. He didn't throw harsh accusations or raise his voice. Instead, he disappeared into his study for hours, sometimes late into the night, leaving a space at the dinner table that grew colder each passing day. The staff who worked in the mansion often whispered about the contrast. To them, Harrison was polite but distant, answering questions with clipped responses. His wife, Sylvie, was always more approachable, carrying warmth where his quiet indifference filled the air. She greeted the gardeners, remembered birthdays, and brought order to a house that otherwise felt hollow. In the city, Harrison was the man everyone wanted to know. At home, he was a stranger. The gap between these two versions of him widened with each passing year, and Sylvie was the one left to carry the weight of that distance. Sylvie Bennett Cross had always believed in building a home where love could thrive. When she first married Harrison, she filled their mansion with warmth, fresh flowers. In the foyer, carefully prepared meals, laughter shared with visiting friends. She thought those gestures would remind him that home was more than a place to sleep. It was a space to belong. But devotion has limits when it's met with silence. Night after night, Sylvie set the table for two, only to pack food away untouched. She prepared his favourite coffee in the mornings, yet most times it grew cold before he even noticed it was there. She decorated their rooms with colours she thought he'd like, hung family photographs on the walls, and waited for his smile when he saw them. That smile never came. Her loneliness didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, through empty conversations, missed dinners, and the constant sound of doors closing between them. She spent hours in the garden, pruning roses or tending to the herbs she grew for cooking, simply to fill the silence that pressed in around her. She read novels late into the night, not because she was restless, but because waiting for him had become her routine. Sylvie was present, giving, and loyal, yet each passing day reminded her that love without acknowledgement feels like living in an echo chamber. Your voice reaches out, but nothing ever comes back. Some couples tear each other apart through shouting matches. Others slam doors, trade insults, and leave behind wounds carved by words. For Sylvie and Harrison, there were no explosions. Their marriage was defined by what wasn't said. The silence was heavier than shouting could ever be. At the breakfast table, she'd ask how his day looked. He'd nod, eyes already on his phone. At night, she'd try to share something about her own day, only to be met with a distracted M&M before he retreated to his study. It wasn't rejection in the loud sense, it was worse. It was absence while sitting right across from each other. Sylvie sometimes wished they would argue, even once. At least anger meant passion. At least anger meant he still cared enough to feel something. Instead, she felt as though she were fading, her presence barely acknowledged, her heart weighed down by indifference. The distance grew thick around them, making even the smallest gestures strained. Passing him a cup of tea felt like offering kindness to a wall. Watching him leave in the morning without a kiss goodbye felt like living with a ghost. It wasn't one fight that broke her spirit, it was the emptiness stretched over years, until even her reflection in the mirror began to look unfamiliar. Sylvie often reminded herself that Harrison had never struck her, never shouted at her, never humiliated her in public. To the outside world, she was fortunate. But what the world didn't see was how silence can cut deeper than anger. Words left unspoken become a wall. Nights passed where she longed to hear a simple thank you or a tender good night. Days went by where she wished for a touch on her hand, a glance that said, "I see you," yet nothing came. That absence chipped away at her spirit, leaving scars no one else could see. She learned the hard way that cruelty doesn't always wear the face of rage. Sometimes it hides in neglect, in the choice not to listen, not to notice, not to care. Silence became Harrison's weapon, and Sylvie bore the bruises of invisibility. The lesson was painful, but clear. A marriage without communication is no marriage at all. Love cannot survive on wealth or appearances. It needs presence, attention, and respect. Without those, even the grandest mansion becomes an empty cage. The words clung to her skin long after Harrison had spoken them. "I can't stand her any more." They echoed in her chest with a weight she couldn't shake. Sylvie pressed her back against the hallway wall, as if the cool surface could steady the tremor running through her. This wasn't the kind of heartbreak that came with surprise. Deep down, she had known the distance between them was growing, felt the coldness every time he walked past her without a word. But knowing and hearing are not the same. Hearing his voice slice through the air left no room for hope. It wasn't speculation. It wasn't her overthinking. It was the truth, spoken from his own lips. Tears threatened, but she refused to let them fall. To cry in that moment would mean surrender, and she needed strength to stand. To breathe, to survive the collapse of everything she once believed in. She pressed her hand against her stomach, willing herself to hold steady. Her marriage had just ended with a whisper, and she was the only witness to its burial. The silence of the mansion suddenly felt suffocating. Every tick of the clock in the hallway grew louder, pressing into her ears, reminding her of all the time she had wasted waiting for him to come back to her. Her body felt rooted in place, but her spirit was already slipping away. She realized she could no longer remain in a house where love had died, where her existence had been reduced to something burdensome. It wasn't anger that filled her, it was devastation, layered with clarity. She knew then that her life could not continue in the shadow of a man who had already discarded her in his heart. Sylvie could have stormed into the study that night. She could have demanded explanations, raised her voice, and forced Harrison to face the cruelty of his words. But what would that have changed? A man who could whisper such disdain when he thought she wasn't listening had already made his choice. So she made hers. She walked back to their bedroom with a steady calm that surprised even her. The house was dark, the hallways wide and empty, yet her steps felt certain. She opened the closet and began pulling down a small travel bag, the same one she had once used on their honeymoon. There was no anger in her movements, only resolve. She folded her clothes neatly, selecting only the essentials: dresses, a sweater, undergarments, and a coat. She tucked away her journal and a photograph of her parents, items that held more meaning than any jewelry in the drawers. The hardest part wasn't the packing. It was the quiet acknowledgement that she wasn't coming back. With each item placed in her bag, she severed another tie to the life she had built. Sylvie didn't wake the staff, didn't slam doors, didn't leave a trace of chaos behind her. She moved like a shadow, quietly preparing for the dawn. She knew confrontation would only give Harrison more power. Silence, in this moment, was her shield. Leaving without a word was the only answer left to her. By the time the first signs of morning began brushing against the horizon, Sylvie's decision was complete. She would walk away, not with fury, but with dignity. Before leaving, Sylvie knew she had to leave something behind. Not an explanation, not a plea, but a final mark of closure. She sat at the small desk in their bedroom, the one where she used to write grocery lists, notes for staff, or little reminders for Harrison that he rarely noticed. That night, it became the place where she would end her marriage. She pulled out a sheet of paper, her hands trembling slightly as she set the pen to it. Her words were few. They had to be. Anything more would sound like begging, and she refused to beg for love that no longer existed. "You've said enough." That was all she wrote. 4 words that carried every ounce of her heartbreak and her strength. 4 words that reflected the finality of what she had overheard. Beside the note she placed her wedding ring. the simple band she had once cherished as a symbol of forever. She twisted it off slowly, the metal sliding over her knuckle, leaving behind the faint indentation of years worn. For a moment she stared at it, lying there on the wood, no longer tied to her finger, no longer tied to her future. She didn't shed tears as she left the desk. She had already cried too many nights into her pillow, hoping Harrison would turn toward her, hold her, or even speak with kindness. The ring and the note were not for him to understand. They were for her to release. When Harrison entered that room later, he would see the hollow circle where love once lived, paired with words that would haunt him more than silence ever had. When Sylvie finally stepped outside, the morning air felt different. It wasn't liberation she felt right away. It was grief. Grief for the woman who had given her youth, her loyalty, her dreams to a man who now dismissed her with a whisper. Each step down the stone pathway toward her car felt heavy, as though she was walking away from more than a mansion. She was walking away from the life she once thought would last forever. Her heart cracked under the weight of memories, the nights she had waited for him to come. Home, the dinners she had cooked, hoping to spark conversation, the mornings she had woken, with hope that he might notice her presence. Every memory now felt like a thread cut loose, drifting behind her as she moved forward. But beneath the heartbreak, another force stirred, courage. It wasn't loud or defiant, it was quiet and steady. The kind of courage that whispers, "Enough." The kind of courage that reminds a woman she deserves more than to be tolerated. Driving away from the mansion, Sylvie's tears blurred her vision, yet even as her chest ached, she gripped the wheel firmly. She wasn't leaving in defeat. She was leaving because she chose herself and the life growing inside her over a marriage that had already ended in silence. Her heartbreak was undeniable, but so was her strength. And though she didn't yet know what waited in the coastal town she was heading toward, she knew one thing with certainty: she had survived the breaking point, and survival was the first step toward reclaiming her life. The mansion shrank in her rearview mirror as Sylvie's car cut through the early morning mist. The long drive carried her away from the heavy silence that had defined her life for years. Each mile placed distance between her and the words that had shattered her heart. Still, as the city faded into the background, her chest felt both hollow and strangely light. She drove without looking back, guided only by the instinct to reach someplace, far enough that Harrison's presence could no longer touch her. After hours on the road, the grey skyline gave way to the calming sound of waves in the distance. The ocean stretched out endlessly, as though offering her a horizon she had been denied in her marriage. The coastal town was nothing like the bustling city she had left behind. Here, streets were narrower, lined with weathered buildings that spoke of history and resilience. Cafes with open doors spilled the smell of fresh bread onto sidewalks. Children laughed as they ran barefoot near the beach, their joy unrestrained and contagious. For Sylvie, it was a world that moved at its own rhythm, untouched by the constant demands of wealth and status. When she stepped out of her car and inhaled the salty air, a quiet realization settled inside. This town didn't know her name, her history, or the whisper that had ended her marriage. Here, she was anonymous, and in anonymity, she found her first taste of freedom. Sylvie's first step toward building a new life was finding a place to rest her head. She chose a small apartment above a corner bakery. The space was far from luxurious, peeling paint along the window frames, creaky wooden floors, and a kitchen barely large enough for one. Yet when she set her suitcase down, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. The rooms were quiet, but not suffocating. The silence here belonged to her, not to Harrison's indifference. Every morning the scent of fresh bread drifted upward from the bakery below, waking her gently. The owner, Mrs. Alvarez, was a warm, elderly woman with quick hands and a quicker smile. She greeted Sylvie with loaves still warm from the oven, and often insisted she take one upstairs. "You need strength," she'd say, pressing the bread into her hands with motherly care. To support herself, Sylvie walked down the cobblestone street and applied at the town library. The building was small but full of life, with rows of well-worn books, and a steady stream of visitors who treated it like a second home. The head librarian, Mr. Green, welcomed her with little hesitation. "We need someone with gentle patience," he said, handing her the schedule. It was steady work, cataloguing, helping children with story time, and keeping the quiet hum of knowledge alive. For the first time in years, Sylvie had a rhythm that wasn't dictated by Harrison's moods or absences. She woke early, opened her windows to the sea breeze, worked at the library, and returned home to the sound of laughter drifting from the bakery below. Her life was modest, stripped of luxury, but it felt genuine, and that, to her, was priceless. Healing didn't arrive all at once for Sylvie. At first she carried her sorrow like a second skin, invisible but heavy. Yet little by little the coastal town began to ease the weight she bore. At the library, children tugged at her sleeves, eager for another story. Their wide eyes and endless questions often drew laughter from her lips, laughter she thought she had lost forever. She found joy in small exchanges, a thank you from a stranger she helped find a book, a shy smile from a teenager. Studying late, even the casual greetings from neighbours who soon recognized her as part of their community. Her evenings became a quiet sanctuary. She cooked simple meals in her small kitchen, the sound of the sea breeze through the open window replacing the cold silence of the mansion. She no longer ate alone in despair, but in contentment, grateful that her meals no longer went untouched. Independence became her strength. She paid her own rent, budgeted carefully, and walked the streets of the town with her head held high. No one knew her as Harrison Cross's wife. No one pitied her or expected her to play the role of the quiet hostess. She was simply Sylvie, a woman rebuilding, and perhaps the most healing gift of all was breathing freely. No longer did she pause, waiting for the sound of Harrison's footsteps or the creak of his study door. No longer did she fear what mood he might bring home. She breathed without hesitation, filling her lungs with the salty air and her heart with something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Though Sylvie's days in the coastal town began to bloom with lightness, there were moments when her hand instinctively drifted to her stomach. Beneath the soft fabric of her dress, she carried a truth no one around her knew. When neighbours welcomed her into their lives, when Mrs. Alvarez sent up bread, when children tugged at her sleeve in the library, Sylvie smiled warmly. Yet in the privacy of her small apartment, she often sat by the window with one hand resting against her abdomen, whispering softly into the silence. She hadn't told a soul. To the townspeople, she was simply a newcomer, starting over. But in her heart, she knew her escape had not been only about freedom. It was also about protection. She was guarding more than herself now. At night, as the waves crashed against the shore, she let her secret strengthen her resolve. The child within her deserved a love she could never have provided under Harrison's roof. This quiet reason fueled her every step, her every decision, giving her the courage to keep moving forward, no matter how uncertain the road ahead seemed. Her neighbours saw a woman reclaiming her life. What they couldn't see was the deeper truth, that Sylvie was also preparing to bring new life into the world, a life that would one day reveal why leaving had been the only choice she could make. The truth had come to Sylvie weeks before the whisper that shattered her marriage. She remembered standing in the bathroom of the mansion, the faint morning light spilling across the tiled floor as she stared at the test in her hands. 2 lines, her breath caught, and for a moment she pressed her palm to her lips, stunned. Pregnant. The word felt both terrifying and miraculous. Her first instinct had been joy. For years she had wondered if motherhood would ever bless her. She had planned to tell Harrison in a gentle, thoughtful way, perhaps over dinner, with candles lit and soft music playing. She imagined watching his face change, imagined his distant eyes softening as the news broke through the walls between them. She pictured him reaching across the table, his hand finding hers, promising to do better for the family they were about to create. But that moment never came. Instead, his whisper, "I can't stand her anymore," erased the future she had carefully pictured. The test she had once clutched with trembling hands turned from a symbol of hope into a secret she guarded fiercely. Now, in her small apartment above the bakery, she carried that secret alone, and though her body ached with the weight of it, her spirit clung to one truth: this child deserved a life defined by love, not silence. At night, when the town quieted and the waves whispered beyond her window, Sylvie would lie in bed with one hand resting gently against her growing belly. Those were the hours when she spoke freely, no longer silenced by Harrison's absence or indifference. "You'll know, love," she murmured softly, her voice carrying both promise and prayer. "Even if it's only from me, you'll never go a day without feeling wanted." She told the baby about the coastal town, the bakery downstairs that filled the air with sweetness, the library that hummed with stories, the sea that stretched out as if it were endless. She promised they would walk those sandy shores together, that laughter would replace the cold stillness she had once endured. Sometimes she confessed her fears too. "I don't know if I'll be enough. I don't know how hard this road will be. But I swear you'll never feel alone." The child, still hidden, became her closest companion. Each flutter, each shift inside her body reassured her that life was still moving forward, that something beautiful could rise from the ashes of heartbreak. Talking to her unborn child gave her strength she hadn't realized she possessed until now. These private conversations became her lifeline. They weren't only about calming her own heart, they were the foundation of the bond that would carry them both into a future Harrison would never control. Sylvie's resolve deepened with every passing week. As her body changed, so did her sense of purpose. The child growing inside her was more than a responsibility. It was a chance to break the cycle of emptiness that had consumed her marriage. She promised herself that her home, no matter how modest, would never feel as hollow as the mansion she had left behind. There would be laughter echoing in the walls, stories read aloud before bed, and kisses placed on little foreheads each morning. Her child would never have to beg for attention, never wonder if they mattered, never feel the sting of being unseen. When she walked through the library aisles, she found herself selecting children's books, already imagining bedtime stories. At the bakery, she lingered on the scent of cinnamon rolls, thinking of small hands reaching for them with delight. Even the ocean waves outside her window became part of her vision for the future, a backdrop of freedom and safety. Her determination burned quietly but steadily. She didn't need wealth or status to give her child a good life. What mattered was presence, affection, and the courage to stay true. She had learned the hard way that love cannot survive in indifference. This time, she would give her child what she had long been denied, a home where love was spoken, shown, and lived every day. Sylvie often reflected on the night she left the mansion. To others, it might have looked like an act of defeat, the decision of a woman too broken to stay. But she knew the truth. It had been an act of protection. Walking away wasn't only about saving herself, It was about shielding the child she carried from growing up in a home where silence spoke louder than love. She didn't want her baby to witness cold dinners, unanswered questions, or the ache of waiting for affection that never arrived. Her choice to leave was rooted in courage, not fear. It was the understanding that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is walk, away from what diminishes them, even when every memory begs them to hold on. She had loved Harrison once, but love without respect had no place in the life she wanted to build for her child. Each day in the coastal town reinforced that lesson. Every smile from a stranger, every kind gesture from her new community, every quiet moment she shared with her unborn child reminded her she had made the right choice. She hadn't run away. She had chosen to protect what mattered most. Her story was no longer about loss. It was about strength, survival, and the quiet power of walking away to create something better. Harrison Cross wore his reputation like armor. In the city, he still walked into meetings with his usual sharp stride, nodding at investors and shaking hands with politicians who admired his success. His suits remained immaculate, his words measured, his image unshaken. To the outside world, he was untouchable, the millionaire who built an empire from grit and determination. But once the doors closed and the lights dimmed, the cracks began to show. Behind the mask of power, the mansion told a different story. The dining room, once filled with Sylvie's quiet efforts to bring warmth, now sat untouched. The air felt colder without the soft hum of her presence. Staff moved cautiously, as if aware that something essential had slipped away, but afraid to name it aloud. Harrison pretended her absence meant little. He told his colleagues she had gone to visit family, brushed off questions with a shrug, and laughed away concerns. Yet every evening, when he returned to the house, the silence gnawed at him. No one waited by the door. No dinner was laid out with care. No gentle voice asked about his day. The house wasn't alive anymore. It was a shell, echoing with emptiness. The public man thrived on appearances. The private man was drowning in solitude, even if he refused to admit it. The mask he wore in public grew heavier by the day, and each time he removed it at night, he faced the hollowness left in Sylvie's absence. For years, Harrison had believed his empire stood solely on his shoulders. His decisions, his brilliance, his relentless pursuit of profit. Yet, without Sylvie, the balance began to shift in ways he never expected. She had never sat at boardroom tables or signed contracts, but her influence had been steady, invisible, and essential. It was Sylvie who managed the household gatherings that quietly impressed his partners. It was Sylvie who remembered personal details, birthdays, anniversaries, preferences that softened his sharp business edges in social circles. Her warmth had been a buffer, transforming Harrison from a ruthless negotiator into a man people felt they could trust. Now that balance was gone. At first it was subtle. Investors started declining dinner invitations, claiming busy schedules. Business associates hesitated longer before signing deals, their smiles not reaching their eyes. Rumours spread in whispers that Harrison's marriage was in trouble, and soon that trouble began to colour his reputation. If a man couldn't keep his home intact, some asked quietly, how could he manage an empire? Even within his own company, cracks appeared. His assistant noted that he was distracted, often rereading the same documents or forgetting instructions he had given. Meetings grew tense, projects stalled, and the confidence that once surrounded his name began to waver. Harrison had built his empire on precision and power, but without Sylvie's presence grounding him, the foundation began to shift. What he once thought was unshakable now showed signs of collapse, and for the first time in years, Harrison felt the weight of loss seeping into every corner of his business. The mansion had never felt so large. Each room echoed with an emptiness that even Harrison couldn't ignore. He wandered the halls at night, restless, his footsteps bouncing back at him like reminders of what was missing. In the dining room, he caught himself staring at the long table where Sylvie once set out dinners, meals she prepared even when she knew he wouldn't show. Now the polished surface reflected only his solitude. In the bedroom, the untouched side of the bed felt like an accusation. He found himself reaching out in the dark, half expecting her warmth, only to meet cold sheets. Sleep abandoned him. He tossed between memories he had ignored for years, her laughter in the garden, the way she adjusted his tie before meetings, the quiet devotion she had poured into the home. He had dismissed these as ordinary, but in her absence they revealed themselves as extraordinary. They were the glue that held his life together, and without them, everything seemed to be falling apart. For the first time, regret sank its claws into him. He replayed the moment in his study, the careless whisper to his brother, and realized how final those words had been. They hadn't only pushed Sylvie away, they had broken something in himself. The silence of the mansion was no longer comforting, it was suffocating. And with every passing night, regret grew louder, demanding to be heard. Before we continue, let me ask you this. After everything Harrison has done, after the silence, the coldness and the words that shattered Sylvie, do you think he deserves forgiveness? Should a man who let his pride destroy his marriage be given a second chance? Or are some mistakes too heavy to repair? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Mr. Ashford's Love Stories so you never miss another story filled with love, choices and the lessons they bring. Ellis came into Sylvie's life without fanfare. He was not a man of loud entrances or polished appearances. He was a carpenter, his hands roughened by years of work, his shoulders broad. From lifting wood and tools, his voice carrying a steady calm. The first time Sylvie saw him was at the library. He had come to repair a shelf in the children's section that had leaned for months. "Won't take me long," he said with a polite nod, kneeling down with his toolbox. She expected him to finish quickly and leave, but instead he worked with quiet care, smoothing every edge, tightening each screw until the shelf stood firm again. When he was done, he didn't ask for praise. He simply smiled, wiped his hands and said, "Books should always have a safe place." From then on, she began noticing him more. Ellis walked past the bakery most mornings, greeting Mrs. Alvarez with the kind of warmth usually reserved for family. He carried groceries for the elderly, fixed broken chairs without asking for payment, and never seemed in a hurry to rush through life. Where Harrison's world had been defined by speed and sharpness, Ellis moved with patience, grounded in the present. What caught Sylvie most wasn't what Ellis said, but what he noticed. When she shifted uncomfortably while carrying books at the library, he stepped in to help without making her feel weak. When she brushed her hair from her face while shelving, he quietly offered, "You've been working hard. Maybe take a break." His attentiveness was never heavy-handed, never demanding. It was simply presence, the kind she had longed for in her marriage and never received. For a woman who had been invisible in her own home, Ellis's quiet recognition felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Ellis never asked Sylvie why she had come to the town, nor did he pry into her past. He seemed to sense that she carried stories she wasn't ready to share, and instead of demanding answers, he offered space. That restraint, paired with his steady presence, became the foundation of their growing connection. As her pregnancy advanced, small details caught his attention. When she shifted her weight while standing at the library counter, he would quietly pull up a chair. When she reached for a box on a high shelf, he appeared beside her, retrieving it with ease before she had to stretch. If she walked slower along the narrow streets, he adjusted his pace without comment, simply keeping stride with her. One afternoon, after noticing her wincing as she carried a stack of books, he spoke in his calm, practical way. "Let me help. You shouldn't be lifting that much." His words weren't a command, nor pity. They were care, spoken plainly. Sylvie found herself leaning on him more than she intended. She had lived so long in a home where she asked for nothing, expecting nothing in return, that receiving help felt unfamiliar. Yet Ellis never made her feel like a burden. Every time he assisted her, it felt less like dependence and more like partnership, even if they hadn't called it that yet. Their intimacy grew in small, unspoken exchanges. He noticed her. He respected her. And in those quiet gestures, Sylvie felt something she hadn't felt in years, safe. The bond between Sylvie and Ellis deepened not through grand gestures, but through the simplest acts of kindness. One evening, after seeing her rub her back at the library, Ellis appeared at her apartment door, holding a small paper bag. Inside were herbs he had gathered from his garden. "Steep them in hot water," he explained, placing the bag in her hands. "It'll help with the aches." When she brewed the tea later, the scent filled her small kitchen with warmth, and the first sip soothed her tired body in ways she hadn't expected. The gesture was practical, yet it carried tenderness that touched her far more deeply than she let on. Moments like that became a rhythm between them. Some evenings, he would sit with her outside her apartment, both of them sharing bread from Mrs. Alvarez's bakery while watching the sea in comfortable silence. Other times, he managed to coax laughter from her, the kind of laughter that started small and soon spilled out freely. He teased her gently about the way she furrowed her brow while shelving books, and she countered with remarks about the streak of sawdust always clinging to his shirts. Their companionship was never forced. Ellis didn't fill silences with empty chatter, nor did Sylvie feel pressure to perform. They could sit side by side, listening to the waves crash beyond the town, and that quiet was enough. After years of suffocating silence in her marriage, she realized there was a difference between emptiness and peace. With Ellis, silence was not absence. It was presence, a space where she could finally breathe. The shift between friendship and something more came quietly, yet unmistakably. One evening, after a long day at the library, Sylvie walked outside to find Ellis waiting for her. He held a lantern in his hand, the light casting a gentle glow across his features. "Didn't want you walking home alone," he said simply. The gesture, so unassuming, stirred something deep within her. As they walked together, she found herself glancing at him, noticing the steadiness in his stride, the warmth in his voice, the way his presence calmed the unease she sometimes felt about the future. Over time, touches grew natural, his hand brushing hers as he passed her a book, his steady palm at her elbow when she stepped down a curb. Each contact lingered a second longer than necessary, enough to send a quiet thrill through her that she hadn't felt in years. One night, as they sat outside her apartment sipping tea, laughter faded into silence. But it wasn't the silence she had known with Harrison, the cold, heavy kind that suffocated. This silence was charged, filled with unspoken questions and the possibility of something new. Ellis met her eyes, and for a brief moment neither looked away. The spark between them was not rushed. It didn't demand or overwhelm. It unfolded slowly, like a flame nurtured with care, steady and undeniable. And though Sylvie hadn't yet put it into words, she knew what she was feeling. For the first time in a long time, she was wanted, not for appearances, not for duty, but simply for who she was. Harrison Cross had spent weeks pretending he was unaffected, but the cracks in his life had grown too wide to ignore. His empire was faltering, Whispers of his wife's disappearance reached every corner of the city, and the polished mask he wore in public no longer shielded him from suspicion. Determined to reclaim control, he used every resource at his disposal: private, investigators, discreet calls, financial trails, until the answer came. A quiet coastal town, far from the reach of his empire. When his car rolled onto the cobbled streets, it looked out of place against the simple shops and weathered houses. He stepped out, his tailored suit and polished shoes marking him as a man who didn't belong there. Yet his eyes scanned with sharp intensity, driven not by love, but by pride wounded in public. He spotted her outside the library, her hair pulled back loosely, her hands stacked with books. For a moment, his stride faltered. She looked different, not fragile, not weighed down. There was a lightness in her step he hadn't seen in years. Sylvie froze when she saw him, the blood draining from her face. She had always known this day might come, but the sight of him standing in her sanctuary felt like a storm intruding on calm waters. The quiet town around them seemed to still as he approached. Children playing near the bakery paused, their laughter fading, and even the wind seemed to hesitate. Harrison's presence was like a shadow stretching across the street, and Sylvie braced herself for the confrontation she had dreaded since the night she left. Harrison didn't waste time on greetings. His jaw was set, his eyes sharp, every word carrying the weight of his bruised ego. "You embarrassed me," he spat, his voice low but filled with venom. "Do you have any idea what people are saying? Do you realize how you made me look? Leaving without a word, vanishing like some coward? My investors, my partners, they whisper behind my back because of you." Each word dripped with accusation, but none carried remorse. He didn't speak of love lost, of the pain her absence caused him. To Harrison, her disappearance was not about their marriage. It was about the tarnish on his name. Sylvie stood still, the stack of books clutched against her chest. The townspeople passing by slowed, sensing tension, but pretending not to stare. Her heart pounded, but not from fear. It was anger. Anger at the audacity of a man who reduced years of neglect, silence, and betrayal into a claim of embarrassment. For years she had waited for him to notice her, to see her pain. Now, as he towered over her, all he saw was his own reflection. His pride had suffered, and that was what mattered to him most. Harrison's voice hardened further. "You've humiliated me. Do you know how it feels to have people doubt me because of what you did? You should have stayed. You should have known your place." The words struck like blows, but Sylvie no longer bent beneath them. She lifted her chin, her silence carrying a defiance he hadn't expected. She had broken free once. She wasn't about to bow to him again. Sylvie set the books down on the library steps, her hands no longer trembling. She looked straight at Harrison, her voice calm but unyielding. "No, Harrison," she said, her words cutting through the space between them. "You embarrassed yourself." The sentence landed heavier than a scream ever could. People nearby turned their heads discreetly, sensing the sharp edge in her tone. Harrison blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. He wasn't used to her speaking with such certainty. "You think I humiliated you by leaving?" she continued, her voice steady. "What humiliated you was your own neglect, your silence at the dinner table, your indifference when I begged for your attention without saying a word, your whisper in the hallway. Those 6 words destroyed our marriage. Not my choice to walk away." Her eyes burned with years of pain, but beneath it was strength. She wasn't the timid wife waiting for his approval anymore. She was a woman who had chosen freedom, who had chosen dignity over the gilded cage of his wealth. "You built your empire on appearances," Sylvie went on, her voice unwavering. "But appearances crumble when there's no truth behind them. I wasn't your burden, Harrison. I was the one who held your life together quietly, while you acted as though I didn't exist. If people doubt you now, it's because they see the truth, that without me, the man you pretend to be doesn't exist." Harrison's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing, but the words had struck. For the first time, he couldn't respond with arrogance. The woman before him wasn't the one he had silenced for years. She had found her voice, and it cut sharper than any accusation he could throw. Sylvie's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, a gesture so natural that Harrison's eyes followed it before he realized what it meant. She held his gaze firmly, her voice measured but resolute. "I didn't leave because I was weak," she said. "I left because I had to protect more than myself. You didn't know it then, but I was carrying your child." The words hung heavy in the air. Harrison froze, his breath catching as though the ground had shifted beneath him. His lips parted, but no sound came. The man who had spent his life commanding boardrooms, silencing opponents, and bending others to his will suddenly found himself speechless. His eyes darted to her abdomen, then back to her face. The truth crashed into him with the force of a tidal wave. All this time, while he had been sulking in pride and anger, she had been nurturing. The one thing he claimed he always wanted, an heir, a continuation of his name, and he had pushed it away before it even began. "You're lying," he said at last, but his voice lacked conviction. It trembled, betraying the fear clawing at his chest. "I have no reason to lie," Sylvie replied, her tone calm and absolute. "This child will never know the coldness I endured in that mansion. I won't let your pride shape their life. They deserve more, and I will give them that, whether you stand beside me or not." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, Harrison felt the sharp sting of consequence, not in his business, not in his reputation, but in the deepest part of himself. Harrison staggered back half a step, his usual composure faltering. The certainty in his voice, the unshakable pride that had carried him through every deal, every confrontation, slipped away. For the first time, he looked less like the untouchable millionaire and more like a man cornered by his own choices. He stared at Sylvie, his eyes clouded with disbelief and something he had long suppressed, regret. "A child?" he whispered, the weight of the word dragging his voice down. His arrogance had no place here, not when confronted with the truth that his indifference had cost him more than his wife. It had cost him the chance to be present for the most important part of his life. The mask cracked further when he reached for words and found none. His usual weapon, his sharp tongue, was useless. Pride had been stripped from him, replaced by a raw awareness of what he had destroyed. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his hand falling helplessly to his side. Sylvie, standing tall, didn't flinch. She saw the change in him, the way his power melted into vulnerability, but she didn't mistake it for redemption. His silence now was not strength, it was the beginning of his reckoning. For years she had been the one silenced. Now, with truth on her side, the silence belonged to him. The story spread like wildfire. At first it was a whisper among business circles, questions about why Harrison Cross. His wife had vanished, rumours about tension behind the mansion's closed doors. But once the truth surfaced, there was no containing it. Headlines blazed across newspapers and online platforms. "Millionaire abandoned pregnant wife." Articles detailed Sylvie's quiet departure, painting her as the woman who had been cast aside while carrying the heir to his empire. The press latched onto every detail, amplifying her dignity and his disgrace. Television anchors debated the scandal, panellists dissected his character, and blogs championed Sylvie as a symbol of resilience. Her photo, once overlooked, became the centerpiece of sympathetic coverage. A woman who had suffered in silence now had the world listening. For Harrison, the exposure was unbearable. Cameras followed him from his office to his car, microphones shoved in his face. With pointed questions, "Mr. Cross, is it true you drove your wife away? Do you regret your words now that she's pregnant? Have you spoken to her since she left?" Every time he refused to answer, the silence was framed as guilt. Every time he snapped at a reporter, it fueled the narrative of arrogance. The image he had spent years building, the polished millionaire admired for. His discipline crumbled in front of the very people he had tried to impress. He had once believed reputation was his greatest asset. Now it was a mirror reflecting back his failures for the entire world to see. The media storm was only the beginning. The scandal soon reached boardrooms and investment tables, places where perception often mattered as much as performance. Harrison's once loyal partners, men and women who had praised his decisiveness, began stepping back. At first, they claimed scheduling conflicts, meetings were postponed, calls went unanswered. Then the excuses turned into action. Withdrawn investments, delayed contracts, and deals frozen without explanation. It wasn't about the numbers on his spreadsheets, it was about trust, and trust was slipping through his fingers. Whispers turned into questions. If he treated his own wife so coldly, how could he be trusted in partnerships? If his judgment failed at home, could it fail in business too? The impact rippled quickly. Stocks linked to his company dipped. Long-time investors quietly shifted their money elsewhere. Projects he had championed stalled because no one wanted to be associated with a man whose name now screamed scandal. Inside his once bustling office, Harrison felt the shift. Employees who had once stood tall under his leadership now moved with unease, their eyes avoiding his. The air of command he had carried for years was gone, replaced by uncertainty that infected the entire company. The empire he had built brick by brick wasn't crumbling because of bad strategy or poor markets. It was collapsing because the foundation, the image of reliability and strength, was fractured beyond repair. And at the centre of that collapse was the wife he had dismissed. The woman whose absence spoke louder than his millions ever could. For years, Harrison had believed pride was strength. He thought silence was control, indifference was power, and distance was discipline. But now, stripped of the image he had clung to, he saw what pride had cost him. He returned to the mansion each night and found no peace. The halls felt colder, the rooms darker, not because of the absence of light, but because of the absence of her. He walked past the desk where Sylvie had once left her note and the ring, unable to move them, unable to forget the simplicity of her final words, "You've said enough." The echo of those words haunted him more than any headline. The world could call him ruthless, arrogant, or cruel. He could bear that. What he couldn't bear was the knowledge that Sylvie had left not out of weakness, but because he had pushed her too far. His pride had turned love into emptiness, and in doing so, he had lost the one person who had given meaning to his life beyond numbers and deals. For the first time, Harrison admitted to himself that money had no value without someone to share it with. He had believed himself untouchable, yet here he was, alone, disgraced, and facing the very consequences he thought he was too powerful to endure. Pride had been his shield, but now it was his downfall. And as he sat in the silence of the mansion, regret finally settled into the spaces pride once filled, heavy and relentless. While Harrison's world unravelled, Sylvie's life in the coastal town blossomed. Her modest apartment above the bakery transformed into a place of warmth and anticipation. The walls, once bare, now carried small touches of home. Fresh flowers on the table, folded baby clothes in a basket, and books stacked neatly in the corner ready for bedtime stories yet to be read. Ellis became her anchor through every stage of her pregnancy. When her feet ached, he built a sturdy footrest for her chair. When she worried about the future, he reminded her gently, "You're not alone in this." He crafted a wooden cradle by hand, each stroke of his tools filled with patience and care. The first time Sylvie ran her fingers over its smooth surface, she felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness but from gratitude. Their evenings were filled with simple joys. Ellis brewed herbal tea, the same blend that had first soothed her, while Sylvie leaned back and let laughter return to her life. They took slow walks along the beach, her hand in his, her growing belly shielded by his steady presence beside her. For the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for love. She was living in it. As the weeks passed, excitement replaced fear. Sylvie prepared for her baby's arrival with a confidence she hadn't known she possessed. With Ellis at her side, she felt strong enough to face motherhood, not as a woman abandoned, but as a woman cherished. Her new life was built not on wealth or appearances, but on love that was present, attentive, and real. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. If you were in Sylvie's place, would you have stayed in a marriage without respect, or walked away to protect your peace? Is love without respect worth staying for? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Mr. Ashford's Love Stories for more powerful stories about love, choices, and the lessons they bring. The night Celine came into the world was quiet, with the waves rolling steadily beyond the town. Sylvie's labour had been long, her body trembling with exhaustion, yet determination guided her through every breath. Mrs. Alvarez stayed close, holding her hand, whispering encouragement, while Ellis remained steady at her side, his presence a calm anchor in the storm of pain. Hours later, as dawn's first light touched the horizon, the sound of a newborn's cry filled the small apartment. The cry was strong, piercing, alive with promise. Tears streamed down Sylvie's face as the midwife placed the baby in her arms. Celine's tiny fingers curled instinctively around her mother's, and, in that instant, every wound, every scar of the past seemed to fade. She studied her daughter's delicate features, the soft curve of her cheeks, the faint wisps of dark hair, the peacefulness that washed over her once she nestled against Sylvie's chest. For the first time since leaving the mansion, Sylvie felt complete. She had walked away from emptiness, and here in her arms was proof that she had chosen correctly. Holding Celine, she whispered a vow through tears and tired breaths, "You will always know love. You will never doubt it." It was a promise not made lightly, but one forged through years of neglect and finally fulfilled through the arrival of her child. The baby's presence filled the room with warmth, erasing the lingering shadows of her old life. In that fragile, perfect moment, Sylvie knew she hadn't simply survived, she had created a new beginning. Ellis's role in Celine's life began the moment she opened her eyes. Though he wasn't bound to her by blood, his devotion was immediate and unwavering. While Sylvie rested after the exhausting birth, Ellis cradled the baby with careful hands, his rough carpenter's palms holding her as if she were made of the most delicate glass. In the days that followed, he became the steady presence both mother and child needed. He rose early to fetch fresh bread from the bakery, making sure Sylvie had food within reach as she nursed. He built a small rocking chair by hand, smoothing the wood until it gleamed so Sylvie could sit comfortably with Celine in her arms. When the baby cried through the night, he was there, sometimes holding her while Sylvie slept, sometimes simply sitting nearby to let Sylvie know she wasn't alone. His care wasn't grand or dramatic, it was constant. He noticed when Sylvie's shoulders sagged with fatigue and stepped in without being asked. He watched Celine with a quiet wonder, as though he was witnessing something holy. Each time she stretched her tiny arms or closed her eyes against his chest. What touched Sylvie most was his ease in embracing a role many men would have resisted. He never reminded her that Celine wasn't his by blood, never set conditions, never questioned his place. He simply chose to be there, present, attentive, and proud. In Ellis, Celine gained not only a father figure, but also the kind of protector and nurturer Sylvie had always dreamed her child would know. And in Ellis's devotion, Sylvie saw proof that family isn't measured by wealth or status, but by love given freely and without demand. Late one evening, when Celine finally drifted to sleep in the wooden cradle Ellis had built, Sylvie sat by the window with a blanket around her shoulders. The town outside was quiet, the ocean tide pulling in and out, steady as her own breath. She let her mind wander back through the path that had led her here. She thought of the mansion's halls, grand but empty. She remembered nights of waiting, dinners gone cold, the silence that had weighed on her more heavily than shouting ever could. Those years had nearly broken her spirit, yet leaving them behind had given her a chance to discover what strength truly was. Now, as she watched her daughter's tiny chest rise and fall, she saw her survival not as escape, but as transformation. She hadn't just endured, she had rebuilt. Her life was no longer defined by wealth or appearances, but by laughter in her kitchen, warm bread on her table, and the quiet joy of holding her baby close. Freedom, she realized, wasn't only about leaving Harrison, it was about reclaiming herself. The woman who had once been silenced now spoke with actions louder than words. Every choice she made affirmed that she had the power to create a future where love and dignity would never again be denied. With Ellis by her side and Celine in her arms, Sylvie finally understood that true survival meant more than standing after the storm. It meant building a new life in the light that followed. As Sylvie rocked Celine in her arms one morning, sunlight streaming through the window, the lesson she had lived became undeniable. All the wealth in the world had once surrounded her. Grand rooms, fine meals, glittering chandeliers, but none of it filled the hollow space left by neglect. Money had bought her a house, but not a home. Now, in a modest apartment above a bakery, with Ellis brewing tea in the kitchen and her daughter nestled against her chest, she finally understood what true richness meant. It was in the steady heartbeat of a man who showed up without condition. It was in the cries of a newborn who represented both survival and hope. It was in the freedom to breathe without fear of silence pressing down on her. Self-worth, she realized, was not something another person could grant. It was something she had to claim. Walking away from Harrison hadn't been the end of her story. It was the beginning of a life where love, presence, and respect mattered more than appearances. Her journey proved that titles and fortunes fade, but love endures when it is nurtured. Respect strengthens bonds in ways money never can. And dignity, holding on to one's value even when others fail to see it, is the foundation of true freedom. Sylvie kissed Celine's forehead gently, whispering, "You'll grow up knowing what matters most. Love, respect, and self-worth. Those are the treasures no one can take from us." And with that vow, she closed the chapter of her old life forever, stepping fully into the new one she had built with courage, sacrifice, and love that could never be bought. Sylvie's journey was never about revenge. It wasn't about proving Harrison wrong or watching his empire collapse. Her story was about something deeper. The quiet, unwavering truth that love without respect cannot survive. The world often teaches that success is measured by wealth, titles, and recognition. Harrison embodied that belief, and in the process, he lost the very things that mattered most. His downfall was not because of financial missteps, but because of pride, the kind that blinds a man to the treasure standing right in front of him. Sylvie's strength lay not in fighting to stay, but in knowing when to leave. By walking away, she showed that self-worth is not negotiable. She proved that a woman's value is never tied to a man's approval or the grandeur of his possessions. Her life flourished the moment she chose dignity over wealth, love over pride, and peace over appearances. This story reminds us that the most profound victories are not seen in boardrooms or bank accounts. They are found in the courage to protect one's heart, in the resolve to demand respect, and in the decision to build a life rooted in genuine love. One evening, as the sea breeze drifted through the window and Celine slept soundly in her cradle, Sylvie stood quietly, watching the rise and fall of her daughter's tiny chest. Ellis entered the room, his hands dusted with sawdust from a project he had been working on, and paused when he saw her. "You look at peace," he said softly. Sylvie turned to him with a faint smile. "For the first time in a long time, I am—" She reached down, brushing her fingers gently across Celine's cheek. Memories of the mansion threatened to surface. The silence, the emptiness, the whisper that had shattered her world, but she let them fade, replaced by the warmth of the life she had built. "I used to think my worth was tied to being someone's wife," she admitted, her voice quiet but steady. "But I was wrong. My worth is mine to define, and now I know I am enough. Enough for myself, enough for her." Ellis stepped closer, placing his hand on her shoulder, grounding her in that truth. Together they looked at Celine, and Sylvie's words carried a quiet finality. "I will never let her grow up questioning if she's loved. She'll know it every day. That's the future I choose." In that simple vow, the shadows of her past finally lifted. Sylvie's journey teaches us something vital. Money can vanish, reputations can crumble, but love and self-worth endure when they are chosen and protected. True strength is not in clinging to what diminishes you, but in walking away and building something better. Now I want to hear from you. If you were in Sylvie's place, would you have walked away after hearing Harrison's cruel words, or would you have stayed to fight for the marriage? Do you believe respect is worth more than wealth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters, and it helps us all reflect on what truly defines love. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Mr. Ashford's Love Stories, and share it with someone who needs this reminder today. Every story here is crafted to move hearts and inspire courage, and with your support, we can keep telling them.